They shot his dog and thought the story would end there. Officers Brent Callahan and Duval Knox saw Lionel Briggs, a quiet black man walking his German Shepherd in a suburban neighborhood, and assumed he was just another target. They didn't see a neighbor, they didn't see a veteran, they saw a threat. When Lionel complied, they escalated. When Bishop, his loyal companion, stepped forward to protect him, they opened fire without warning. But when they picked Lionel Briggs, they didn't know who they were messing with. They didn't know he was a decorated Delta Force commander, trained to survive war zones, trained to dismantle power, not with rage, but with precision. And what came next wasn't just justice, it was methodical, public, and irreversible. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you're watching from, and make sure to subscribe, because the story you're about to hear isn't just about one man. It's about all of us. Outside, the air was still. A breeze moved slowly through the trees as the leash dangled by the door, unworn, untouched. Inside, Lionel sat in silence, not defeated, preparing, because this time justice would not knock. It would break the door down. For nearly a decade, Lionel Briggs had lived in quiet defiance, an unassuming black man with a steady gait, a silent past, and a fiercely loyal German Shepherd named Bishop by his side. Most afternoons, you could find them pacing the sidewalks of Oak Ridge Estates, a picture of routine serenity. Bishop's polished black coat gleaming in the sun, Lionel's military posture softened by civilian life. The neighbors barely knew him, but they knew of him. Polite, private, always nodding but never lingering. He didn't speak much of what he did before the sleepy suburb, but the lines etched into his face told stories no one dared ask about. That Tuesday afternoon was no different, until a police cruiser crawled to a halt near the curb like a predator scenting prey. Officer Brent Callahan and his partner, Duval Knox, had earned a reputation in Oak Ridge for targeting those who didn't blend in, and to them, Lionel never had. They saw a large black man in boots and a working jacket walking a powerful dog. They didn't see discipline. They didn't see years of service. They saw a threat. "Afternoon, sir," Callahan drawled as the cruiser's window rolled down. Lionel turned with practiced calm, his hands visible, his eyes unreadable. "Afternoon, officers," he answered, polite, reserved, never aggressive. But even that wasn't enough. Knox was already out of the car, boots thudding on pavement, his hand grazing his holster like it was second nature. They started with the usual script. "You live around here? Got any ID on ya?" "That's a big dog. He trained?" Lionel responded as he always had, evenly, honestly. But it didn't matter. They weren't looking for answers. They were looking for reasons. Reasons to control, to intimidate, to remind him of his place. And Lionel? He'd seen it all before, in war zones and back alleys half a world away. But never like this, not in front of his own house, not with Bishop watching. He could feel the leash tighten in his hand, not from the dog, but from his own body bracing for what was coming. Why is it that sometimes the greatest danger isn't what you carry in your hands, but what others project onto your skin? The moment Lionel handed over his ID, the tone shifted, just slightly, like a string pulled too tight. Callahan barely glanced at the card before dismissing it with a flick of his fingers. "Funny," he muttered. "Don't recall seeing you at the homeowners' meeting." Knox smirked, pacing closer to Bishop, whose ears tilted, his frame tense. "It's a serious animal," he said, voice low, as if talking about a loaded weapon. "What's he trained for? Attack?" Lionel's voice remained calm, measured. Protection, obedience, he follows commands. But that didn't satisfy them. It never did. Knox stepped in close, too close. "You sure you got him under control?" The leash didn't so much as twitch, but Lionel's heart did. He knew the game now. He'd seen it before. In dusty checkpoints, in hostage zones, in villages no map cared to name. This wasn't about protocol. This was about provoking. About dominance. Bishop gave a low, nearly imperceptible growl, just a sound, not a threat. but it was all the justification Knox needed. "Back your mud up," he snapped. Callahan's fingers danced near his holster, and Lionel raised his free hand, the leash still firm in his other. "He's not a threat," he said. "Neither am I." But no one was listening. They were seeing something else entirely, an illusion crafted by fear and prejudice. And when Bishop instinctively stepped forward, placing his body between Lionel and the officers, Knox reached for his gun. Time slowed, instinct flared. Lionel pulled the leash taut, but it was already too late. Knox was shouting, Callahan drawing his weapon, and for one breathless second, Lionel realized this wasn't going to end peacefully. Not here, not today. It was a moment forged from nothing. A calm man, a silent dog, and two officers too drunk on power to see either clearly. What do you think would have happened if Lionel had flinched? If he hadn't known how to keep still when every muscle screamed to move? The crack of the gunshot didn't sound real, not at first. It rang out across the quiet street like thunder in a clear sky, sharp and sudden, followed by silence so complete it felt like the world had stopped breathing. Bishop jerked mid-step, his body twisting unnaturally before crumpling to the pavement with a sickening thud. Lionel didn't scream. He dropped to his knees beside the dog, hands already soaked with blood, mind desperately clinging to training that told him how to stop a wound. But this wasn't a battlefield, and Bishop wasn't wearing armor. "No, no, stay with me," he whispered, cradling the fading weight of the only living soul who had never judged him. Bishop's eyes searched his face, still alert, still loyal, even as the life slipped out of them. Across the pavement, Knox stood with his gun raised, chest heaving, expression unreadable. Callahan just shook his head and muttered, "Told you that dog was a liability." The rage that rose in Lionel's chest was different from anything he'd felt in combat. It wasn't adrenaline or survival. It was betrayal, not by a nation or a cause, but by the land he called home. And then it happened. The weight of everything collapsed on him all at once. The fear, the fury, the helplessness. Lionel's scream tore through the air, not a cry for help but a roar of grief, primal and raw, so powerful it made even Knox take a step back. What do you do when the system you serve turns its weapon on your peace? On the only thing you had left that felt like safety. A second later, Lionel was tackled, forced to the ground by knees and elbows and fists that didn't belong to protectors, but to predators. And just like that, he was no longer a neighbor, no longer a veteran, no longer a man who walked his dog in the afternoon sun. He was cuffed, bleeding, and very, very awake. The world faded to gray as Lionel sat alone in the cold fluorescent light of the holding cell, hands still trembling, Bishop's blood drying beneath his fingernails. Time lost all meaning. There were no clocks, only the endless drone of distant voices and the hollow thud of footsteps echoing through the precinct. The loss pressed in on him from all sides, sharp and suffocating, refusing to be dulled by shock or exhaustion. He replayed the moment over and over, Bishop's eyes on his, the silent question in that final breath. The officers' faces, impassive, unaffected. A numbness crept over him, threatening to drown out the rage. How many times had he seen men broken by loss, by the senseless violence of conflict? But he'd always believed coming home meant leaving that behind. Now, staring at his stained hands, Lionel felt a new truth settle in his chest. There was no sanctuary, not here, not anywhere, if men like Callahan and Knox could murder with impunity. What would you do if the only justice left to you was the kind you made for yourself? Lionel pressed his forehead to the cool concrete wall, letting the grief turn hard, letting it become resolve. He would not let Bishop's death fade into the background noise of another day's news cycle. He would not let himself disappear into statistics or sympathy. As the hours crawled past and the city outside carried on, Lionel Briggs made a silent promise. He would bring the world's attention to what happened on that sidewalk, and he would not rest until the men who destroyed his peace paid the price, one way or another. By the time Lionel was released, the world had already begun to move on. But he hadn't. The department offered no apology, no report, no accountability, just silence, as if Bishop's blood could be rinsed off the sidewalk with a garden hose and forgotten by morning. Back at home, the leash still hung by the door, untouched. His boots stood where he'd kicked them off before the walk that never ended. The house, once filled with soft footsteps and quiet companionship, had become a mausoleum of memory. But Lionel didn't grieve like ordinary men. His grief turned into study, into planning, into purpose. He tracked Callahan's patterns, followed Knox's habits, memorized their weaknesses, not because he was impulsive, but because he was trained. Patient. Lethal. What would you become if the people who took everything from you walked free, unpunished and smiling? Lionel became something new, something they couldn't anticipate. He waited in shadows, watched from parked cars, jotted notes on napkins at diners while their routines played out like clockwork. He wasn't stalking, he was preparing. And when the moment was right, when the arrogance in their gait revealed their blind spots, Lionel made his first move. Callahan never saw it coming. One moment he was stumbling out of his favorite dive bar, the next he was doubled over in an alley, wind knocked out of him, ribs screaming in protest. Lionel didn't speak, not yet. He let the pain speak first. When Callahan finally opened his eyes through blood and confusion, Lionel leaned in close and whispered, "This is what it feels like to be powerless." Then he disappeared, leaving the officer broken and gasping in the dark. And just like that, the balance had shifted. News of Callahan's assault spread fast inside the department, but outside it barely registered. No cameras, no witnesses, just a bruised cop with no suspect and too much pride to admit he'd been outmatched. But for Lionel, it was only step one. The real game had just begun. He knew Knox would be next, angrier, more cautious, but still vulnerable. Lionel followed him for days, blending into shadows like a memory he couldn't shake. He watched Knox drink himself numb in the same dive bar night after night, his paranoia blooming but directionless. And then, one rainy evening, when Knox stumbled into a narrow alley behind the bar, Lionel struck. The blows were clinical, unrelenting, each one measured like a beat in a metronome. No anger, no hesitation, just purpose. Knox collapsed against the wall, wheezing, his badge doing nothing to protect him. "You remember me now, don't you?" Lionel said, voice calm, almost conversational. "You shot my dog, you ruined my peace, and now I'm going to ruin your life." Knox tried to speak, but Lionel wasn't done. He crouched beside him, voice low and surgical. "I won't kill you. I want you alive. To feel this unravel, to wake up every day wondering when it'll come again." He stood, leaving Knox bleeding in the dark, as forgotten as the lives he'd destroyed. But Lionel knew vengeance alone wasn't enough. It couldn't just be fists in the dark. It had to be public, documented, permanent. What's justice if the world never sees it happen? And so Lionel set the final stage, his own home. Cameras hidden, door unlocked, bait placed with care. He knew they'd come, and when they did, fists raised and smugness in full bloom, he let them beat him, let them feel in control, because this time every punch they threw was a nail in their own coffin. The video was perfect. Crystal clear footage captured every smug word, every shove, every punch that Callahan and Knox delivered inside Lionel's home, the illegal entry, the threats, the brutal assault. And while they thought they were teaching him a lesson, Lionel was giving them a mirror. Within hours, he edited the tape, clipped the audio, overlaid the timestamps, and sent it to a carefully curated list. Civil rights attorneys, investigative journalists, watchdog groups, and one trusted friend inside internal affairs. Then he waited, not with anxiety, but with stillness, like a man who had already walked through fire and was watching the smoke catch wind. By morning, the video had gone viral. Decorated veteran beaten by officers in his own home. Headlines flared across screens, commentators raged, protesters gathered, and the department, blind to the storm until it landed on their doorstep, scrambled to react. Knox and Callahan were suspended within 48 hours, too late to control the narrative. The footage spoke louder than any press release. For the first time, Lionel's voice wasn't buried, it was echoed. What would you do if the truth finally had the power to shatter the silence? As reporters swarmed the precinct and social media drowned in outrage, Lionel remained quiet, calm. The cameras showed him as the victim, but he was far more than that. He had orchestrated a reckoning. This wasn't revenge, it was exposure, and it had only just begun. They thought firing Callahan and Knox would be enough, a PR sacrifice to calm the storm, to let the department breathe again. But Lionel didn't want breath. He wanted accountability. So he pushed further. He filed formal complaints with dates, locations, badge numbers, every moment. Those two men had abused their power, not just against him, but against others too afraid or too broken to speak, and the city listened. A grand jury was convened, charges were filed, excessive force, illegal search and seizure, aggravated assault, and, most damning of all, attempted murder. When the trial date was announced, the headlines shifted again, corrupt officers to face justice in landmark case. Inside the courtroom, Lionel sat in tailored silence, clean-cut, composed, the very image of discipline. But beneath the suit was a man holding every scar, every bruise, every loss with terrifying clarity. Across the aisle, Callahan and Knox looked like shadows of themselves, pale, twitchy, stripped of the swagger their badges once gave them. The jury didn't just hear Lionel's story, they saw it. Surveillance footage, hospital records, eyewitness testimony from his sister, who had stormed into the precinct the night he was arrested, armed with legal fire and fury. When Lionel took the stand, the room leaned in. They didn't see a neighbor, he said. They saw a threat. And they killed the only soul in this world who ever made me feel safe. His voice didn't tremble, but it made others cry. What happens when a man who's mastered war is forced to fight just to be seen as human? The prosecutor's closing was razor sharp. This is not a misunderstanding. This is a pattern, and it ends today. And in that moment, Lionel knew they wouldn't just lose their jobs, they would lose everything. The courtroom was electric with anticipation as the jury returned, 12 citizens now carrying the weight of truth on their shoulders. They didn't need long, the evidence was overwhelming, the testimony unforgettable. One by one, the charges were read. Guilty. Excessive force. Guilty. Illegal search. Guilty. Aggravated assault. And finally, guilty. Attempted murder. Callahan's jaw clenched so tightly it looked ready to crack. Knox simply stared at the floor, his arrogance hollowed out into silence. The judge, a stern man with years of weathered cynicism behind the bench, leaned forward. "You abuse your power," he said. "You betrayed your oath, and you have shown no remorse." His voice dropped. "For that, this court sentences you both to 25 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole." The room erupted, some in gasps, others in stunned silence, and a few, quietly, in tears. But Lionel, he didn't flinch. No smile, no sigh, just the quiet exhale of a man who'd carried a mountain and finally set it down. He stood as they were led away in cuffs, their uniforms now just cloth, stripped of meaning, of protection, of the power they once wielded like a weapon. And for the first time, they didn't look like officers, they looked like men, small, scared, and utterly alone. Do you believe the system can truly deliver justice, or was this just one rare moment when it finally didn't look away? As Lionel stepped outside the courthouse into a swarm of cameras and microphones, he didn't make a speech. He said one sentence, clear, sharp, and final. They got what they deserved. Then he walked away, his back straight, his heart heavy, but no longer broken. The grass was damp beneath Lionel's boots as he walked the winding path through the veterans' cemetery, a leash wrapped tightly in his fist, not to guide, not to restrain, but to remember. He stopped at a small headstone etched with simple words, "Bishop loyal to the end." The air was quiet, still, the kind of silence that settles only after a long, hard fight. Lionel crouched, running his hand gently across the stone. "It's done," he said, voice low, edged with fatigue that went deeper than sleep could fix. "They're behind bars. 25 years, no parole, no more badges, no more pretending." His other hand tightened around the leash. The leather was worn, cracked, stained in places only he understood. "I kept my promise." A breeze stirred, soft and almost warm. He paused, staring at the headstone as if expecting Bishop to come bounding over the hill, tongue out, tail wagging, ready for another walk. But there was only wind. "You knew what they were before I did," Lionel whispered. "You tried to protect me. And I couldn't protect you." He closed his eyes for a moment, letting that truth settle, then opened them again, clearer now. "But I made them pay. Not with bullets, with truth, with fear. I let the world see what they really are, and made sure they can't hurt anyone else ever again." He stood, slow but steady, placing the leash at the foot of the grave. "This isn't peace," he murmured, "but it's justice. And maybe that's the best we ever get." He turned to go, then paused, glancing back one last time. "Would you have told me to stop, to let it go?" A long breath. "Maybe, but I couldn't." The wind whispered through the trees. "Do you think forgiveness always comes before justice? Or sometimes, does justice have to come first?" With that, Lionel walked away. Not in triumph, not in sorrow, but in stillness. Because now, finally, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt earned. Sometimes the people we trust to protect us are the ones who cause the deepest harm. And when justice feels out of reach, it's tempting to let bitterness take root. But Lionel's story reminds us that even when the world breaks something precious in us, we still have the power to decide what we'll do with the pieces. He didn't run. He didn't explode. He waited. He planned. And when the time came, he held up the truth. Not with vengeance in his hands, but with quiet strength in his heart. That's not weakness. That's wisdom. Life has a way of testing our patience and our faith, especially when we're older and we've seen too much to be surprised by cruelty. But maybe the lesson isn't about how hard we hit back. It's about how deeply we hold on to what's right, even when no one else does. In a world that often mistakes silence for submission, Lionel proved that calm isn't the absence of power. It's the evidence of it. And maybe that's the kind of strength that changes things. Not all at once, not loudly, but for good. The cemetery was quiet, but Lionel didn't need noise to feel what mattered. He stood beneath the late afternoon sky, a single hand resting on the cool stone, etched with Bishop's name. There were no reporters, no cameras, no applause. Just a man, a memory, and the kind of strength that doesn't raise its voice, it endures. He didn't come to celebrate revenge. He came to say thank you, to grieve, to breathe, and to begin again, because what comes after pain is choice. Rebuild or retreat. Lionel chose to rebuild, not just his own life, but the kind of justice that outlives the moment. He knew this wasn't the end of racism, of abuse, of injustice, but it was one less silence in a world too full of them. His voice joined a chorus, and now it carries forward. If this story stayed with you, share it. Subscribe to Echoes of Racism so these voices don't fade into silence. In the meantime, I've chosen 2 stories I think will move you just as much. Take care, and we'll see you soon.